All right, we're online recording.
Thank you. All right. Call the meeting to order at 7:04 p.m. I will read the Zoom statement required by the governor to allow remotely held meetings. This meeting of the Noank Zoning Commission will take place through Zoom remote meeting technology. My name is Rick Smith, Chairman of the Commission. The host of the Zoom meeting is Larry Dunn, alternate Zoning Commission member. The participants in this meeting will be the commission members, elected alternate staff, and the commission's counsel if he joins. Anyone speaking should state their names prior to speaking each time they speak. Participants who would like to comment on an item or share a screen item should indicate such by using the raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen or by raising your hand in front of the screen. After the raised hand has been detected, the participant will have the opportunity to speak after being called upon by the chairman. Participants should mute their microphones until called upon. To offer a motion or second a motion, commissioners should physically raise their hand and be acknowledged by the chairman. To vote on a motion, commissioners will be called on individually by the chair. Members of the public who have logged on or called in will be observing the meeting, but there will be no public comment. All participants must identify themselves before speaking each time they speak. Members of the public can submit comments by writing to the commission after the meeting for consideration on any item discussed. Finally, a recording of tonight's meeting will be posted on the Town of Groton's website within 7 days of the meeting. And I just noticed we had to change that part of the system. In the agenda, which you've seen because you're on the meeting, there is a fourth link. At the last link gets you to the recording of the night's meeting on YouTube. So that's how you would access that if you want to see what, remind yourself what was said, or if somebody else wants to see it. Okay, that's that. I'd like commissioners and alternates to identify themselves. It's probably better if I name you because your orientation on the screen is different from anybody else. So Dana Oviet, wave your hand. Okay. Nip Tanner, raise your hand. Beth Steele. Okay, 3. Blake Powell is absent. Larry Dunn is seated for him as an alternate and therefore with the full rights and privileges of a commissioner tonight. My name is Rick Smith. I'm the chairman. Lynn Marshall is an alternate who's routinely been involved. And Jen Johnson is our staff member. And then I see we have a dozen or so observers. Good to have you. Okay. The sole order of business tonight is short-term rental discussion. At the last meeting, I had suggested a way forward for tonight, which would be to allow any of us to ask questions, so-called cross-cutting ideas, based on the 7 proposals that you heard, and then find out if anyone's fundamental position had changed. If so, how, and if not, we could proceed to the decision-making document, that large matrix we had before we went to the individual plan presentations. So commissioners, is that approach for tonight okay with you, or would you like to amend it or do something different? Okay, seeing no objection, do you have any questions of the others that in effect follow-on questions to the presentations you heard back over the last 2 meetings? Okay, has anyone's position changed based on what you've heard? Okay, mine actually did in a certain way. Based on what I heard, the way I'm going to focus myself going forward is here's a short list of ways that I'm going to change what I had proposed. Make it more simple, particularly with enforcement, make enforcement as simple as possible, but that may still include some kind of an internet application that monitors things like days rented and so forth, but simpler the better. I'm gonna try to support things that are the same rules for everyone to the extent possible. I've looked at this matrix, for example, and tried to make it as much one rule for everyone as possible. And there are a couple of things that I think we still need to debate. I have a view on number of rentals per period that is different from, or somewhat different from what I had proposed originally. So I've tried to absorb into what everybody else seemed to be leaning towards. As you know, I had advocated for prohibition of events, but allowing parties of some size, and most people wanted to just prohibit large parties and events, and I've acceded to that in my own mind. Some of the parking, I had a few caveats. I've pulled one of them off my own table to try and make that more a parking has to be off the street to the extent possible. I can tell you why I feel that way now, but if you've driven through Noank on a summer day, you know why. Picture a fire engine and so forth. That's kind of where my mind came after listening to the presentations. So I'd invite anybody else, if that's provoked you into thinking, you know, ways you can think of to get towards the happy medium that we need to get to. That's the process I use to do it. And I obviously have 3 or 4 things to debate once we get to them, but I don't want to start advocating for my individual views. I just want to talk about how to get us to yes, if you want to look at it that way. Anybody else? Dana?
Dana Oviatt. I'd just like to suggest, not getting into the weeds at all tonight, that is, the only 2 really relevant issues that we have to discuss at this point are frequency of rental and who's going to be allowed to do it, everyone versus limited. Those 2 issues are the crux of what we're trying to figure out. All the rest of it, parking, you know, enforcement, you know, everything else is secondary to those 2 issues. And if we don't get those 2 issues over with, we're not going to make any progress at all, even though we'll continue to go over parking and all the rest of it. I mean, to the extent that I was thinking maybe we should take a vote. I mean, this is just thinking out loud, but maybe we should take a vote on whether we should allow everyone to do it or limited to do it. Maybe we could make progress in going at it that way.
Before we get to a motion, let's see if everybody agrees with your approach. You hit the nail on the head for 2 of the fundamental issues, and if no one disagrees, I would say that's a good way for us to start the debate. Is there disagreement? Okay, seeing Nip.
Yeah, I have a Nip Tanner. I think I'm in support of what Dana is suggesting, and it's to continue down that path. My perception after participating in these discussions for a year and a half is the positions of the 5 commissioners on the range of possibilities in terms of regulations are fairly clear to me. There is a camp that wants, and I think, Rick, you articulated where you have ended up. It's very light touch in terms of regulation and light touch in terms of enforcement. Is somebody
everyone mute everyone that's on. The last number that came on, 843-810, please mute. There you go. Thank you. Okay. Go ahead, Nip.
So I think, my sense is that the majority of the commission members are in favor of a very light touch. I think there are a couple of commission members who are in favor of a much stronger approach, but I don't think they are going to prevail. They have expressed their opinions repeatedly, hopefully logically, forcefully. I don't think they've been successful. So if the majority opinion is to end up with something along the lines of what you described earlier, Rick, I think we should start down the path of crafting that as quickly as possible with the goal of presenting it to the community as quickly as possible so that we can get real world feedback, not just from some people who are currently operating short-term rentals, but from the whole community about whether that light touch is what they really want. And the sooner we can get to that feedback, the better.
Okay. That's not inconsistent with what Dana said.
I agree. That's my point.
Yeah, I thought so. Yep. Okay. Beth, Larry, views on what you heard from Dana and Nip? Agreement, disagreement? Beth?
When I first listened to Dana, I agreed with that. Then when I listened to Nip, I agreed with that too. And to Nip's point though, I mean, it is the 5 that are going to make the decision. Blake isn't here tonight. I'm not saying we shouldn't go forward, but I think we also know what his position is after his presentment. So rather than go through or discuss those 2 issues that Dana outlined, I think we know where everybody stands, and maybe we just go forward from there, or maybe not. I mean, that's just my thought.
Well, I don't know that Blake not being here is going to fundamentally change where we start to come out based on Dana's 2 points. Just like every other meeting, it's unlikely we're going to make a decision tonight that will never change in the future. Hopefully we start coming to the center and having something that we all agree with at the end. And I take Nip's point that the sooner we make a list of all the measures, the better. Probably not wise to try and build that list tonight in a Zoom meeting. It's best to get one of the straw men matrices out there and use it for the next meeting. So Larry, before I offer another comment, did you want to comment, Larry?
Yeah, I'd take myself off mute, Larry Dunn. No, I think I agree. We do need to make some progress. I don't see new information from us coming out. So yes, there could be additional information from the community. So going down the fundamentals and I think there needs to be a vote, because otherwise it's not anything, right? So I think we have to decide what the direction is. And we are still a long way away from having a proposed ordinance. So there's certainly time for making adjustments.
Okay. Beth?
Yeah, I mean, to that point and to Nip's point, I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of good feedback that we've gotten from each other over the course of the last year and a half, but yet I feel like it's always 1 step forward and 2 steps back. We take a vote, we decide, or maybe not a formal vote, but we all kind of agree on one thing, and then it means nothing. I feel like we need to get to a point where we're actually making some determinations, because otherwise this could go on for another year and a half. Somehow we have to whittle it down. I know Nip would love that.
Yeah. Yeah, what I said before is not that we have to keep making the same type of choices over and over again. Eventually we're going to get to the point where we're all satisfied with what we're hearing. If that happens tonight, that's great. Then we don't have to revisit. Particularly, you've all at one time or another said you would like the final decision made by the 5 commissioners, not alternates. So trying to lean in that direction. We can create something tonight, and if Blake agrees with it, then everybody agrees. Or, and if not, it's room for more debate. We should be comfortable with the right decision rather than, forcing it.
Yeah, point of order.
Sure.
Rick, I don't think you can do that. If there's a vote, there's a vote. Then you'd have to wait for another formal meeting
Yeah.
for Blake to participate. It's not, oh, gee, we'll do off on the side and he agrees. He
I
doesn't, okay, all right.
Yeah. All I'm saying is, you're right, it would take another vote, but nothing we do tonight is necessarily formal and can't be changed. It would have to change with another motion. So, as well as if any of the other of us were absent and the mix of people was a little different. The point I would make on Dana's suggestion, I agree those two are key points. I would suggest we take the second one first. Is there any disagreement with that? In other words, who gets to do it? All right. So let's start that debate. See a hand? No. All right. Beth?
As I indicated previously, my position is that everybody should get to do it, and there should be a 3-year moratorium before anyone who's not a current homeowner can do it.
And your idea on the moratorium, if I remember correctly, was starting on the effective date of the ordinance. In other words, you can't backdate it. Yeah, okay. Okay, anybody disagree with that? Yep.
As I laid out in my proposal, I think the folks that are full-time residents get more slack in terms of being operators, and people who are not significant residents are not allowed to do it at all.
Okay, Dana? Dana?
I'm going to defer to Lynn. I want to see what she has to say first, if you don't mind.
Okay. Lynn?
Well, I say we've talked about 3 basic approaches. We've talked about limiting the number of licenses. We've talked about requiring it to be the primary residence. And then we have talked about restricting the amount of the activity per property. So all of those approaches are in line with what we've identified as the problem and with our purposes. They each have advantages and disadvantages. Limiting the number of licenses has the advantage that if we can get the licenses to the people who are already doing it right now and doing it, doing it well, they can continue what they're doing. It also, and what they are doing does not have a negative impact on Noank. If limited, having that same amount of activity with perhaps a small expansion of it were to occur, then there's really no negative impact to Noank, so that's fine. And they and an advantage to that is then that there are would not need to be the restrictions on how frequently they could rent. They can continue doing what they're doing now. So, and it's fairly easy to monitor. So it's just like, who has a license? So I think that has a lot of advantages to it. I think people react, people have reacted strongly. I'm not going to put any numbers on quantities on how many between, in the board or on the community, but But people react strongly to that, feeling that that's really not fair. It's kind of arbitrary, and that people who could be deserving don't get to do it, even though you might have a provision in there, like they could do an unlimited number of room rentals to help them while they're waiting for the license. That still has not been something that has been met with a lot of enthusiasm. I still think it has advantages, but it's not, I don't think that's going to be embraced. The second approach, which is, and that is used successfully in other communities. Another approach that's used in a lot of communities is restricting their rentals to someone for whom it's the primary residence. And there are different definitions of primary residence, but the legal one would be like 6 months and a day. And it just, and people give the same document, provide the same documentation in getting the permit that they do if they were enrolling a child in school, proving that they are residents. And there are lots of official documents that you can do that with. That one actually, that is used in a lot of communities, and it directly addresses what we have said in our history and problem. And quote, some owners contend that short-term rentals are crucial to their ability to afford their homes, considering ever-increasing property taxes. So that directly addresses the homeowners who are residents here. So that's the advantage of it. Again, by keeping the number smaller, it allows them to have unrestricted, or it can allow them to have unrestricted short-term rental activity, and no need to monitor how frequently it's occurring, as long as they're following the other rules. The reason for not having too many places doing it, or too much of the activity, is it hollows out the community. It becomes a place where all of a sudden, if we look at our current regulations, what do we have? We allow the rooming houses, which is renting out rooms. We allow home-based occupations, where it can be only 25% of your property, up to 2 employees, so you have to have off-site parking, and that's it. Allowing everybody to do this, all of a sudden, wow, are we still a residential district? We're allowing all these businesses to take place in residences for, how much time. So some way to restrict the activity, the primary residence, is a good way to do it. What I see is the one negative to that are some of the people who have had a home in their family for generations, and they and they're living elsewhere now, and unless they are able to step up and live here, make it the primary residence, then they would no longer be allowed to do it. That's a tough pill to swallow, but I would say, on the other hand, they are a small number, and we consider our community as a whole. That may be a pill worth swallowing. I have not seen a lot of enthusiasm for that approach as well. So where we seem to be going is with the limited number, limiting the amount of the activity. So in order to keep these residential neighborhoods with neighbors in them, and to discourage commercial investment, this has, or people even people living here just just churning their homes as businesses and not being here as much, that is going to take a pretty severe limitation on the amount of rental activity. As you're allowing everybody to do it, then the amount of activity at each property needs to be limited. People are saying, why? What's the problem?
Hold on a minute. Larry, can you mute Amy's microphone? I can't control it from here. There you go. Thank you. I'm sorry, Lynn. Go ahead.
Yeah, so people are saying, why? What's the problem? If it's okay now, why don't we wait until it gets to be a big problem? Well, that's exactly it. when we see how much resistance there is right now to regulations and how much, how much it's stirred up the community, the more this grows, the bigger an issue it will be. And do we know that it will grow here? Well, it has been everywhere, and it is growing here. And we've had, from
Point of order.
Yes.
I don't know why.
You
Well,
want me to,
There
No,
was
I-
a specific question on the table.
All right.
And as much
All
as I
right.
love Lynn,
I'll stick.
she's
All right.
repeating what she said
I'll
the
pull-
last 3 meetings.
All right. I will pull it back to that. So I think in order, we have agreed that we didn't want commercial investors. So in order to do that, it's going to require a very strict limitation on the number of days. I think in the proposals, I think that Blake did a good job of trying to figure out where that sweet spot would be. And I think Larry addressed that as well. And so that was probably a pretty good range for where that sweet spot is, where people still get help with their taxes and yet are not limited, or it's not enough to have to be commercial activity. So that one also, a disadvantage of that one is it's the most difficult to monitor. But that being said, I think that's the way the commission seems to be going. And I think that all three of those approaches can be made to work. So it's really up to the commission to decide which they prefer, given those advantages and disadvantages.
thank you. The question is who gets to do it? Okay, that's what
Yeah.
we want to focus on,
Yep, those were the three ways of,
right?
so it's limited number of licenses, principal residents, or everybody gets to do it.
Mhm. Okay, others? Dana? Larry, can you make me co-host so I can do some of the management if I have?
Fortunately, for some reason,
Okay,
can't.
I'll ask you if you need to. Okay, Dana, go ahead.
Dana Oviatt. I don't think that it should be left to everyone to have a permit. And the reason why is because that's a scary thought, as Lynn said, and I won't belabor all her thoughts, but basically, if you let everybody do it and you assign, let's just say they can go 100 days of renting if in a year, and we have twice the number in 10 years, Noank will be overrun with short-term rentals. And that's not where we want to be. That could be solved by limiting them in some way. One way would be to have the limited permits the way I suggested. Another way would be Lynn's suggestion or Nip's suggestion. But I don't think that everybody should be allowed to do it. Unless, and here's where it gets to happen in frequency, unless you limit frequency so much that it turned out something like Fenwick's, which was spread around last week, where they are allowing 10 per week, 10 per year. And the rental, as I understand, has to be more than 2 weeks. So, I mean, my thoughts are complicated on that, but that's where I stand.
Okay, Larry? And
Yeah, I think the question,
Lynn,
Larry Don.
mute your microphone, Lynn.
Yep.
Thank you.
I mean, the question on the table is to get a majority to agree on any direction here. And I think it gets down to residential ownership with basically no limits. And if you're not a residential ownership, we limit the days. The third thing is that we should envision perhaps a zoning variance for for a legacy, potential legacy request, and keep it simple. So I'll stop right there. I don't want to go in and justify. We've been doing that, like as I said, for for months.
I
So
understand.
I'd like to get to a point of who wants what.
Okay, anybody else before I go? Okay, my view, and I won't belabor it because I've already justified my position back a few months ago. I can't advocate, I won't advocate for a limited system where some people get the break and other people don't. And therefore, to use Dana's logic, that means you have to get into some number of restrictions on the behavior that depress the tendency that you're worried about, that Dana is worried about, and Lynn, that will be overrun with short-term rentals. First, I don't believe that'll happen, but second, we can put some stopping points in there, like the 3-year moratorium, and like some hopefully reasonable limits on the amount of times you can rent during a month, that will, and the fact of having a permit that's revocable if you cause a problem, and we establish that through our hearing process, should be, in my mind, a sufficient enough deterrent for people flooding Noank with short-term rentals. I just don't see that as a realistic, excuse me, a realistic concern. So that's to the limit on licenses. The primary resident thing I have questions on. To some part of me, I understand the logic of the attractiveness of limiting this to primary residents, but at the same time, it seems unfair to people who are property owners but just don't happen to live here. And that's why I've continued to say there's a difference in my mind between hosted rentals and non-hosted, but not in a way where we're conferring more advantage on somebody because they actually live here. However, that said, I've heard the arguments, and I'm closer to the primary residence argument than I have been in the past. So I fall in Lynn's 3 factors that she described. I fall more towards have one rule for everyone on who can get a permit, and limit the number of days, and use the 3-year moratorium idea and a few of those things to make it helpful to people that want to make some income for whatever they use their income for, but enough of a deterrent that we don't become a community of 80% short-term rentals and 20% the leftover full-time residents. So that's kind of how I'm leaning on the question of who gets to do it. Others? Dana?
I'll just offer something up. I caution everybody trying to make a determination of how many times somebody should be able to rent and backing into the number of times based upon what we think their taxes are, what their special situations are, and how much money they might make from a particular rental. That's going down a road that you do not want to go down. We are not in that business. We're in the zoning business. And when we approve or disapprove a house as being appropriate for Noank, we don't ask the owner, well, how much it's going to cost and do you have the money? That has nothing to do with what we're doing here. So I just want to say, I want to ask you, plead with you, don't go down that road and back into the number of days and frequency that you're going to allot somebody by assuming that somebody needs it or doesn't need it, or assuming that those who need it are going to need this much. Do it on the basis of trying to limit the amount of STR activity that Noank can handle in the future.
I'm hoping that wasn't directed at me because I didn't talk about how much money a person should. Yeah, okay, good. Don't need to comment then. Nip?
I'd like to thank Dana for that. Nick Tanner, I'd like to thank Dana for that comment. I think it's very appropriate and helpful. I think maybe we had been drifting down the direction he's cautioned us against. And I think his point is well made. well worth thinking. Thank you.
Other comments? So I have, well, I don't really have a good sense. I have heard two people say everyone ought to be able to get a permit. I've heard one commissioner say that they ought to be limited. I've heard an alternate say they ought to be limited. I have not heard Nip and Larry to my satisfaction where I see where you're coming from. And you two guys are voting members tonight. Nip?
I'm sorry you don't have a clearer sense of where I'm coming from. I would very strictly limit the number of people who could do it. And full-time residents would be my primary requirement. I'm sorry that I haven't made that clear up until now. My apologies.
Okay, apology accepted. Larry?
Oh, I agree with Nip that full-time residents should have unlimited ability for short-term rental. I would, however, add a second category that if you're non-resident and then have a limited number of days. I would say, to Dana's point, the majority of communities in the United States has limits of days on short-term rentals, right? Not once did I hear anything about any social, economical, or economic issues as a result of doing that. So that's a twofer, I guess, Rick.
So you're saying a full-time resident would have an unlimited ability for short-term rentals and a non-resident would have a number of day limit?
To be determined, correct.
Right, yep. Okay.
Rick?
Yes, Nip.
Nick Tanner. Larry started off by saying he agreed with my position and then stated what he understood my position to be. That is not my position.
Okay.
A full-time resident would not have unlimited right to
Okay.
offer short-term rentals. They would be limited, and they would be strictly limited, but they would, that's a primary requirement. They're a full-time resident. And then how much they're allowed to rent is part two of Dana's question.
Okay. So it's sounding like, I think I hear three commissioners saying that there should be full-time residents and people who are not full-time residents should be two categories of permit holders. Is that what I'm hearing three of you say?
Which three?
Doesn't matter. It's three, but it's you and Larry and Dana. Nip.
Nip Tanner.
Yep.
You're assuming that people who are not full-time residents, I'm okay with them being, that we allow them to operate short-term rentals. We haven't gotten to that part of the discussion. As I said, my primary requirement is that they be full-time residents.
Okay, but the question still is who gets to do it? And if you want to say that only full-time residents can rent, period, that leaves a lot of people out as opposed to property owners. So I didn't hear that from the other two saying that they would limit it that strictly.
I'm not sure they agree with me.
Yeah, I know. That's why I'm asking. I'm trying to find a consensus, but we're not there yet.
Well, Larry Dunn, might I suggest we take it piece by piece and get a vote on each piece and then refine it? I mean, to Art's point is a full-time resident have limits or not, right? Just that, not saying there couldn't be other things, and then move on to the second point and then the third point. Otherwise we keep putting all these things together and we don't seem to be getting to a conclusion.
I'm not sure you can break it apart that way and ignore all the other types of homeowners. That's why I'm,
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. I'm not saying to the exclusion of it. It's just saying, number one, is there a requirement that a resident owner is one of the requirements for getting a short-term permit without restricting the number of residents? Then you can add a second piece to it and then a third piece to it. I mean, if you try and put it all together in one, I think we're going to be spinning.
I agree with that, but I'm not sure how you just described that first question is clear to me.
All right.
Somebody offer a motion, then we'll have something to debate on.
Right. That's what I was just thinking how to structure that.
Nip,
It's my sense that my position on this is at the extreme among the 5 commissioners, including Blake, who is not here, but I think philosophically, I think Larry and Blake are much more closely aligned than, for example, Blake would be with my position. So whatever the starting point for the discussion, I don't think it should be based on what I'm recommending. I don't think it's a winning position with the 5 commissioners. And I expect by the time we get 3 votes in favor of many of the aspects of the regulations, there are going to be aspects that I'm not in favor of. And I understand that.
Mhm.
And
Thank
I
you.
think we need to find the point. I think your goal of finding a middle ground that the 5 of us can agree on is a nice idea, but after a year and a half of these discussions, I think it's extremely unlikely that we are going to get there. And as I said early on, I think the important thing at this point is to find the positions that get 3 votes and move forward. And whatever that ends up with, which I may or may not agree with, needs to go to a public hearing, and we need to find how the community feels about what 3 commissioners supported.
Okay. Larry, did that give you time to draft a motion?
Trying to think of how to make it, but not end it, right? So I think, yes, I'd like to make a motion that in regards to short-term rental requirements for obtaining a permit, that one of the minimum requirements, not exclusively, but one so far, would be that you are a resident ownership that's defined, legally defined in the state of Connecticut.
And you said previously that was the state definition, 6 months here.
It's 6 months and 1 day. Yeah, I think it's a state definition.
Okay, is there a second to that? No second, no motion. Okay. And somewhere in here, just so you're warned and don't become apoplectic, Robert's rule says I can offer a motion if I so choose. I don't choose to at this point, but I may very well if I see us in a moment of paralysis. Chairman can do that when it's a small group, less than 12. So just be forewarned. And it also make you more likely to offer your own motion. So I won't, so you keep me from doing it. That should be a goal too. Okay, Dana?
I don't know if this will be helpful or not, probably not, but you know, my position several weeks ago and several months ago was, and now is that I see short-term activity going on in Noank. And my bottom line is that I don't want to see any more going on in the future. If we're going to have any activity at all, it ought to stay the way it is. And the problem is, I'm being forced into making a decision about which types of citizens, which types of homeowners should be allowed in to do this, when I've already suggested an alternative which would allow those people to do it. But having said that, if I were forced to go along with Larry's suggestion that only people who have primary residency in Noank be allowed to do it, then I would probably say yes.
Point of correction. I didn't say only. I said as a first step,
Okay.
the minimum requirement with that. We could add additional amendments to that.
Thank you.
Just to tell you, if I were to offer a motion, the way I would go in the direction would be, and because Dana and Lynn teased out the differences, and I did once a couple of months ago. You have two choices. You can have a few number of people doing as much as they want, or you can have everyone doing it limited enough so it doesn't become a problem for the neighborhoods. If I were to offer a motion, my motion would be every property owner in Noank can do short-term rentals with the understanding, in other words, they can get a permit with the understanding that there may be limits on how many times they can do that. And those limits also may vary depending on whether it's a hosted rental or a non-hosted rental. Just for a discussion point, that's the kind of thing I'm leaning towards, and it kind of tells you how I would vote on different motions as well. Would somebody like to make that motion, or would you like me to make that motion? Is it effective for it to be on the table as a debatable point? Dana?
Can you run that past me again, please?
Yeah. Every property owner in Noank would have the right to get a permit to do short-term rentals, but their ability to do short-term rentals would be limited number of days or number of times per month. And those limits might vary between the non-hosted rental and the hosted rental. Beth, unmute.
I'll say something only for the sake of, I feel like you're hanging out there and you need somebody to agree. I mean, I'm fine with that as a starting point. I'm just still going back to, I don't see where we get without Blake if we're talking about the 5 members ultimately voting on this. I feel like we have gone and done this over and over and over again. We get a consensus, but it's not a consensus with the actual voting members. And we say that we're going to agree to something, but it has no meaning and we can vote again on it later. We've got to find a path forward to actually decide each issue. And I think we can only do that with Blake. The more I sit here, that's how I feel. I feel like this exercise is just more of the same and we're not getting forward.
I have to say I disagree with you. It may be this is a hard way to come to consensus or come to decisions, and we may go back over the same broken ground. But the debate surrounding our decision-making process is useful. We're getting a better sense of where we want to be. You know, Nip has clarified a number of times where he's getting to. I've tried to do that. It's not an unhealthy debate to continue to, I used to call it honing a knife. You know, you can never sharpen it perfectly with one pass over the stone. You got to keep going at it until you get it to where you're happy. And that's kind of what we're engaged in. So I agree, the final decisions, we need to have the 5 elected voting members because they're going to carry.
Point of order, Rick.
Yeah.
I was also, and Lynn was also elected.
Yeah, I understand.
We're not just strange people.
I understand. But you need to understand there are 5 elected commissioners and there are 2 elected alternates. You happen to be in the unique position tonight that you're sitting as a member. But you and Lynn as alternates enter the debate because we've allowed you to, because we want to get your ideas. You've been both very active in this, but there's a limit. And the limit is when we get to a final decision, it's got to be the 5 people elected commissioner.
That's not how the prior ordinance was actually done, Rick. Remember, we actually had an ordinance. It was voted in, and then we voted it out. I voted on both of those as an alternate.
I don't, No.
That, go back and look at the minutes. Anyway, but that's something you and I will discuss offline.
okay. So, would somebody like me to make that as a motion? All right, I will anyway. I move that every property owner in Noank have the right to obtain a permit to conduct short-term rentals with the understanding that the number of days allowed either per month or throughout the year may be limited, and they may be limited in a distinction between hosted and non-hosted rentals.
Second.
All right. Motion made in second. Jen, I hope you take good notes. Okay. Okay, discussion on the motion. Lynn? Got on mute, Nip, Lynn. I can't do it.
Thank you. Thank
All
you. Lynn Marshall. I see a problem with that in terms of our purpose, where we're trying to keep as many residents in town as we can. So what you're saying is, so let's take I'm going to take the person who is it's my primary residence. And when I'm away from that residence, I want to rent out the whole house. Saying I can do that. And I'm the one that I think we we've heard people say, it's my house. I really care about it. I don't want anybody trashing it. I'll rent it to good people, So, and I'll have a local operator, maybe a requirement that they live in the same, what Beth has suggested, that they live in the same area, like village district to village district, or another district, outside of the village, the residential district in that district, pretty responsive. So, but you're saying that just because they are not on site at that point, that gets more days than someone who, I have a primary residence and I'm commercializing the place next door. So there'll never be a residence there.
And don't get out in front of the motion.
Yeah.
The motion has none of that in it. You're reading much more into it than occurs in the motion.
Well, you haven't defined hosted and non-hosted, and that's part of it.
That's right, but it also doesn't matter at the level of the motion. The fundamental part of the motion is all property owners can get a short-term rental permit, with the understanding that the number of days may be limited and may be different between hosted and non-hosted. All of the other stuff in my proposal and anything else I've ever said is irrelevant to the motion. We'll debate those things later. Other comments? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor, raise your hand. And this is Larry, Dana, Beth, Nip, and me. In favor. 3, opposed. 2, okay. Motion has it. Motion is approved. That's part of the question that Dana, the second question that Dana had asked. Does someone else want to offer a motion? This is who gets to do it. Are there other parts of that that you'd also like to do by a motion? Add to it? Something that you think is missing that is amenable to an addition? Larry?
Well, I'll go back to the original question that if you are a primary resident, there are no limits to the number of STRs you can do. Which means you can have it almost up to 6 months, by the way, just to explain that. Otherwise, you're not a primary resident.
Okay, that's a separate motion.
But yes, that's, you asked.
I know, I did. But
We got to keep adding motion, right?
Didn't you offer that motion and it didn't get a second?
No, I offered something that was more expansive.
Okay,
This one is taking what's on the floor and now starting to define it in terms of part A would be permanent resident or primary resident, and part B would be you're not a primary resident. So to simplify it, I was making a motion just on primary resident, and then we can come back and talk about non-primary resident.
okay, can you make that as a motion so it's clear to me?
Okay. That pursuant to the prior motion, those residents who are primary residents do not have a short-term rental limit.
No.
No,
That's
that's the
different.
motion.
That's different than the motion that passed, though. The motion that passed, that's just for clarification.
It said could, no, what you said was
all
could be
property owners-
subject.
Okay, one at a time. Go ahead.
I mean, I know what you said. You said could be subject to limits based upon whether it was whether it's hosted or non-hosted, which is primary resident or not primary resident.
No.
So then you left it open. So now it's saying is how do we then better define what the current position is? And that's all I was trying to do, right?
Okay.
Part A would be primary residency. Part B is non-primary residency. So it was a very simple motion on primary residency. What are the limits to that pursuant to the prior position?
Okay, state it again. I heard it as different than the basic part of my motion, which was all property owners can get a short-term permit.
Keep going. You said more in your
No,
motion.
that's the clarification that with the understanding that the number of days may be limited and may be different between hosted and non-hosted rentals.
Right. So I was providing the first part of that for hosted. Says there isn't limits, right?
Okay,
I'm
so your motion is for hosted rentals, there would be no limits, right?
That's what I'm throwing out there to get
Okay.
this moving. Yeah.
I just want to make sure we have it clear. There would be no limits. For non-hosted limits, did you have another part for that?
Nope. I want to do this a piece at a time.
Okay, so your motion is for hosted rentals, pursuant to the prior motion, for hosted rentals, there would be no daily limits. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, is there a second to that? Who is that? Nip or Dana? I saw
Dana.
hands.
I have a question.
Okay, seconded by Dana. Comments, Nip? Wait a minute.
I'm sorry, I did not mean to second it. I had a question with respect to probably Nip's question. Go ahead, Nip.
Okay, Nip Tanner.
First, is there a second? Wait a minute. It's not a proper motion unless we get a second. Who's going to second the motion? Motion dies for lack of a second. Okay, other things you might want to add to the basic question, who gets to do it?
I still have some questions.
Okay, yeah, we're into comments now because if there's no motion. Nip, go ahead.
Okay, I've heard a couple of terminology. This is Nip Tanner. I've heard a couple of terminology. Rick, you said property owner in terms of who would be allowed to operate a short-term rental. Is that
Mhm.
correct?
Yeah, what I meant was resident or non-resident.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
I understand.
Okay, well, but the motion that was approved said property owner.
Yes, and that's what I intended.
And then my other, okay, then we may need to backtrack and get that cleaned up. In terms of Larry's comment, I think he used the term primary residence. And
That's the legal definition, yes.
no, well, I think the legal definition is legal resident. I think primary resident is something other than legal residence. And if we're talking about what we mean is legal residence, 6 months plus 1 day, I think that's the term we should use, so it's clear.
Okay.
Okay, fair point. Thanks. Okay. Dana, you still have a question? No. Okay. Okay. Nip, you had wanted to clear up the resident, non-resident thing. I did that intentionally because I think I've said it enough times before. I don't personally want to make a distinction between somebody who lives here most of the time and therefore they can rent versus somebody who lives here less time and can't rent. I'm willing to consider differences in the allowance of days rental if somebody makes that point, but that's one of the ones I advocated for before, and I backed away from that in the hope to make one set of rules for everybody. So I'm less of an advocate of different daily limits or time period limits based on hosted versus non-hosted. I go back and forth a little bit in there. But you're right, to be clear, when I said property owner, I meant residents or those who don't meet that legal resident requirement. Yep.
Nip Tanner, well, I think we then have a problem with the motion that was voted on by 3 people, because I think the language in it says, all it says is property owner.
Yes. So one of the 3 people, if one of the 3 people would have to move to reconsider, it has to come from the prevailing side. Otherwise, it stands until such time as the next meeting happens and it can then be changed. Okay. I didn't write the book, Roberts did. Okay. Any other additions to the who gets to do it question? Okay, then let's go to the other question Dana asked, which was the frequency of rental. Who would like to engage the debate on that subject? I would, but I'm laying back here. Okay, I will. My view vacillates in 2 ways on this question. If you remember, I advocated for 1 short-term rental a month for non-hosted rentals and once per 2-week period for hosted rentals. But I've rethought that a bit, and in the light of trying to make one rule for everyone, I've reverted to 1 short-term rental every 2 weeks. And to be clear on what that means, you could rent it for 2 weeks or you could rent it for 2 days, but you couldn't rent it to 2 different rental parties in a 2-week period. And my objective here is to meet my sense of what the overall Noank zoning ordinance says, which is, it refers to, the general welfare, the health, well-being, what I call the tranquility of the neighborhoods. So in that light, I'm trying to provide some opportunity for short-term rentals for whatever reason people want to do it, and provide also some quiet time for the neighborhood, which to me is more important based on the purpose statement in the Noank zoning ordinance. Where I vacillate is to have a rule that says one rental every 2 weeks for every short-term renter kind of ignores the reality that in a hosted rental, when it's either the legal resident or the owner lives there and they're renting out a room or a few rooms in their house, to me, our noise problem, our parking problem, all the kind of problems that happen in a non-hosted environment go away because the owner's there and they're the best police officer there. If somebody's misbehaving, they take care of the problem. We probably never hear about it. When I look at it that way, I wonder whether we shouldn't consider making, allowing the hosted renters to do it with no limits. And on the question of the frequency of rentals, limit that solely to the non-hosted rental community. So that's kind of where I stand on the whole issue right now. Anyone else? Larry, and then Nip.
Well, that kind of seconds the motion I made, at least half of it. Where it was if you're the host or the primary resident or the legal resident, then you had unlimited one. That's all I said. I didn't say anything about the second half of that.
So what you were saying is a hosted rental has no limits. We just use a different term. Your definition of a hosted rental is a legal resident.
Correct.
Okay. Well, as I just said, I agree with that. I should have been quicker on my feet and seconded that, but juggling with all the balls in the air. And also, I'm not sure I'm entirely there yet. As I said, I vacillated somewhat. I can see the value of allowing the hosted rentals to have unlimited number of days rental opportunity, but I can also see a short side too, or a downside. And that is the frequency of turnovers, which is one of the things we put in our purpose statement that we were concerned about. So I'm hoping for more debate on the thing rather than taking a hard and fast position right now. I just said what I just said to kind of engage the debate. Nip was next, then Lynn.
Nick Tanner, this is just maybe a point of curiosity. How do you see a hosted rental helping with the parking issue, which you acknowledged, at least in the village, is a major consideration?
If we lean heavily towards off-street parking, you recall I had 2 caveats in there. One of them was to let people park on the street if there was no other possibility for them. I've mentally withdrawn that from my own proposal because one of the things the zoning ordinance purpose statement directly speaks to is to minimize congestion on the streets for purposes of public safety and fire trucks and so forth. And what I had proposed a month ago, that caveat that said if you could only park on the street, you would allow parking on the street, is inconsistent with the Noank zoning ordinance. So in my mind, I've erased that part of it. So my answer to you is all off-street parking, and I have a remaining concern on that. But generally speaking, if the parking is off the street, it solves the congestion problem. Yep.
My question is, how does whether the property is hosted or not hosted affect that outcome?
Maybe missing your point. I don't know why it matters.
Well,
Hosted versus not hosted.
You are promoting hosted properties as ones where we will have minimum number of problems. And it's just not clear to me how the fact that the host is there is going to control whether people are parking where they're supposed to park or somewhere else that they're not supposed to park.
Okay, now I understand your question. I think if the host is there and they have a permit and they understand one of the permit conditions is that they make their renters park off the street and we get a complaint, we go through a hearing and pull their permit, that's enough of a disincentive that the host who's present is going to make people park where they're supposed to. If the people say, the heck with you, I've paid you my money and I'm parking wherever I want, well, that's a problem that we have to deal with in the zoning enforcement end of things. I wouldn't presume that's going to happen. I think it's more likely that people are going to park wherever the owner tells them to park. And if we tell the owner they have to be off the street, we let the owner enforce that.
Understand your answer. Thank you.
Right. Well, you raised a good question on a non-hosted rental. That's more likely to be where the problem arises. You had asked how does hosted, but really I would answer the other half of the question is we have to tell the short-term rental operator who is a non-hosted non-host, he's not there, he's got to do his best to make sure they park off the street. If they don't and we get a complaint, arguably their agent goes over and finds out it's a problem, the agent solves the problem, or we have a hearing and a revocation hearing. So others? Dana?
Dana Oviatt. So Rick, I missed it. What would be your frequency limitations on either the hosted or the non-hosted?
Two choices. One rental per 2-week period. You could limit that by May through October and then do something differently in the winter. I would say even, winter rentals are very unlikely according to comments we've received. So I would say one rental every 2 weeks. That ends up being 26 rentals a year, maybe could be 75 days, maybe. Most of them or half of them occurring in the winter months. It provides relief for the neighborhood if it's only one short-term rental in a 14-day period. Then the neighborhood gets their relief. That's one approach. The other approach is to only apply that to the non-hosted rentals and don't apply any limits to the hosted rentals. So those are the two proposals, if you will, the two positions that I offered. Dana?
So in terms of what you just stated, what would the total number of days be? What would be the total number of STR activity units? What increase would occur over, say, a period of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years if we had a doubling of short-term rental operators in Noank?
Well, you're presuming that would happen. And if we adopt some of the other things that we've talked about, like the 3-year moratorium and, a permit that can be revoked, some of those things, those are intended to depress at least the investor sentiment, buy a house in order to do short-term rentals. So I don't buy the premise that you're going to have this doubling or this increase. In my past career, people always did that. They always said, well, what's the worst that could happen? And they do arithmetic and they come up with a god-awful high number, when in reality, there are restraints on it. So my answer to you would be the maximum you could have would be 26 rental periods. That'd be one every 2 weeks. They could be a lot of days if a lot of the short-term rentals were 14 days in duration. But to me, that's not as big a problem as having 2 or 3 3-day rental periods coming one right after another. And when you read across the country the concerns over short-term rentals, it seems to be frequent, short-term. You end up with people coming, for lack of a better term, to party. If somebody rents for 2 weeks, it's probably a summer vacation with a family, and it's less likely to be disruptive to the neighborhood. So I'm saying once per 2 weeks, that would be a maximum of 26 rentals per year. And if they're all weekend type short-term rentals, you come in on a Friday and you go home Monday morning, you could have a maximum of 75 days, of which half of those would be October through the end of April. Maximum, again, it's not likely because there's not a lot of demand at that time of the year. But the maximum you could have would be something like 75 days. Dana?
But arguing the different way, you're assuming that the number of short-term rental operators won't necessarily increase by, let's just say 50% or 75%, leading to an increase in short-term rental units, making Noank what we don't want it to become, which is the reason why we're trying to promulgate regulation in the first place. And, you know, I get what you're saying. I just don't, you know, we're back to the same old graph where we have as the abscissa the number of the frequency of rentals versus the number of people renting. And I think if you're going to say that everybody can do it, you've got to justify that you've picked a frequency that is strict enough so that if you anticipate X number of rent or operators in the coming years, that won't become a problem.
Well, you can't predict the future, but if I see where this is going and trying to back me into accepting limited permits, I'm not going to do that. So, you know, it's just not something I'm going to do for all the reasons I stated meetings ago. The answer to your concern would be to put more restrictions on, either, gosh, less than once per 2 weeks. I did advocate that earlier, I mean, a few months ago, once per month. If a short-term rental is a rental less than 30 days, and that's how the Connecticut statutes backed into it with their tax rule change, you could argue that only let people do it once a month. Be prepared for the backlash. A lot of people will be very upset with that. I'm not advocating for it. That's why I settled on once per 2 weeks. I don't think you're going to have a lot of people desiring to buy houses in Noank for the purposes of short-term rentals if all they can do is rent one short-term rental period every 2 weeks, and they have to wait 3 years before they can even do it at all. Those seem like pretty good backstops to me against the concern that you're voicing that a lot of people will want to do this if everyone can do it. Well, everyone can do it theoretically, but they're going to have some very restrictive limits to contend with. Frankly, I think we're going to get bigger blowback from the people who are already doing it now and can't even accept the notion that once per 2 weeks is on the table. You know, the people are miles apart between nobody wants it at all and others want to do it all the time. And we're still going to try and thread that needle, but you're never going to make people that are poles apart happy on this. I take your point, though. You need to have enough restraint that there's not a gold rush mentality when we get all done with everybody wanting to buy into Noank for the purpose of short-term rental. We have to have enough restrictions to repress that urge. I agree with you on that. Dana.
I'm just going to, Dana, I'm just going to comment on what you said. I don't think we ought to be promulgating regulation based upon what people will say about their distaste for what we've done. I think what we should be doing is promulgate regulations based upon our responsibility to the whole community and what it will be like in the future. I don't think at all we should be worried about whether it will be liked or disliked. I think we should think of the community as a whole and not try and tip the scales as to whether we believe some group would like it or not.
Thank you for your attempt to put words in my mouth. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have to be aware of where you're going to get comments and feedback if you go into this with your eyes wide open. What I'm saying is, I don't care how they spend their money. I don't care really if they're mad at me. I do care what the nature of their comments are, because we're obligated to listen to everybody, even the people that you may not want to agree with. So just please try and comment without putting words in my mouth, and I would appreciate that. Others? Lynn?
My comment is about if it's a hosted short-term rental, that there could be an unlimited number of them. And I think that you have to differentiate what kind of hosted rental you're talking about. If you're talking about room rentals, no problem. I think that's absolutely rational. If you're talking about apartments, however, I think that runs into a problem with one of our goals, which was discouraging the replacement of long-term rental properties by short-term rentals. I think when you have an unlimited number of hosted rentals, that actually encourages the conversion of long-term rental apartments to short-term rentals, and that would decimate an important part of our community. And that that part of our community refers to another one of our goals, talking about our close-knit neighborhood, civic life, community spirit, and sense of community. And those people who are our long-term residents in rentals, they have been living here. Some of them have been living here for many years. Some of them have multi-generational family ties as well. And from this commission and not paying attention to that, it's as though that their ties mean nothing. You have to be a property owner in order for those generational ties to be important.
Was that directed to me? I'm open for anybody.
It's a general comment.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, so I'm waiting for anyone else to comment. I will offer this one then. Nobody's rising to it. I've heard you several times on your concern about losing long-term rental opportunities to the short-term rental community.
It's one of our goals.
I understand that. I don't always win either, and that's not a goal. If you think way back, that I was in favor of, and I spoke against. Not that I don't agree with you on the sentiment, and it is one of our goals, and I'll support it as a commissioner. But when we talk about the details of how to do this, I have to tell you, when we first started talking about these things 2 years ago in the fall of, well, 1 year ago after the hearing last year, I commented, I think the words I used was social engineering, and it's not really apt right now, but it's close. And here's why. I think we need to be careful as much as we can, because obviously this process is going to probably give us something where we're telling people what they can do with their property. That said, I keep looking for the rational basis argument in favor of anything we do. And to say that we're going to tell a property owner that they can't do short-term rentals because we want them to do long-term rentals, knowing that long-term rentals is less productive financially for them than short-term rentals, we better have a real good reason, because I can see that as being a weakness, a hard one to justify. We can have it in our purpose statement as an ideal, to try and get to, but I filter these things. How would I explain it to a person who disagreed with it? And I come down saying, well, okay, I'm telling you, you have to do long-term rentals. You're not allowed to do short-term rentals. And
no, that's not what you're saying. You are restricting the number of days for those, as you are restricting the number of days for other types. And the social engineering thing, I've heard that for about the last time. That's because you're social engineering if you're trying to keep the legacy homes here too, which we've all considered. But here's the thing about that statement that irks me, is that we are doing zoning also has planning involved in it. Now, the way Noank is set up, we don't, usually planning and zoning are the same department. We don't have it set up that way in Noank. And there's a reason for that. Because the planning goes across two different entities. The executive committee handles planning if it comes to what are we going to do with the Noank school, or what are we going to do with the Noank school gardens, or how are we going to, those kinds of things. They have given us the authority to handle the planning that goes along with zoning. So in effect, we are planning and zoning. And if we do zoning without planning, it results in chaos.
Nip?
Nip Tanner. Zoning is basically social engineering. We determine how big houses can be relative to the size of the lot, how tall they can be. Now with our architectural design review, what they can look like. We restrict where people can live, where businesses can operate, what kinds of businesses can operate where. I mean, there's all kinds of, quote, social engineering that's implicit, explicit in zoning. And I think, you apparently are not comfortable with the explanation that's been offered in terms of why we want to preserve long-term rental versus short-term rental. Specifically, that we want to encourage people who live here full-time as opposed to people who come and visit for a few days. And you might not be comfortable with making that argument in front of a judge. I would be perfectly comfortable explaining that we're trying to preserve the neighborhood and that we think we have a better chance to do that with people who are full-time residents here in terms of renting property. And I also am perfectly comfortable with the argument that long-term rentals provide economic diversity to the community that we won't have if we don't have long-term rentals. And I think those are explainable, justifiable. You may not agree with them, but that doesn't mean that they aren't valid arguments.
Okay, others? And by the way, Nip, those are two good points. I do agree with the way you cast them, particularly the second one. So by asking other people to comment, it's not that I'm dismissing what you said. I agree with you.
Okay.
Particularly point two. Others? Okay, Beth, unmute.
Well, I understand Lynn's point. I don't know that it necessarily holds water, because I don't, if you're renting out a room in your home, or you're renting out your home, how much are you getting per night? It varies. But let's say you're getting an average of, you can get $200 a night. So if you take the $200 a night and you multiply that times a limit of 75, let's say, that would be $15,000 a year that you would make. Now, if you're renting your home, let's say you're renting an apartment and you can get $1,500 a month for the rental, times 12, that's $18,000. It actually is in your interest to rent out full time, because you would get steady income, because most rentals are a year long, as opposed to a short-term rental where you may or you may not get the rental. So to me, and I'm not saying it's not a valid point, but it's not something that I think realistically, if I'm a renter and I'm going to have an apartment, I'd rather rent it to a long-term renter because I have guaranteed income for the entire year. So when I'm thinking of it, it's not as big a concern to me.
All right, mute yours, Nip, mute yours, please. And Lynn, you're on.
Yeah, I talked to someone in Mystic who did a conversion from a long-term rental apartment to a short-term rental apartment, and she makes much more on the short-term rental than she did on the long-term rental, and the break-even point is 6 days per month. That's one, but that was hers. So that would end up being 72 days per year is the break-even. She can rent her short-term rental apartment for more than that easily and makes considerably more money.
Okay, others? And Nip and Lynn, please mute your microphones. We were getting some feedback there a minute ago. Okay, other comments? Okay, so this question is frequency of rentals. I'm not prepared to make a motion yet on it. I will if no one else has a better idea. Okay, I move that the frequency of rentals be one rental period per 2 week, one short-term rental per 2 week period year round. And to be clear, that means you can rent to one rental party in the 2 week period. Going to have to figure out boundaries, what starts a period and ends a period, but that's all kind of details that can come later. The principle is one short-term rental party per 2 week period. Is there a second? I see no second. Motion dies for lack of a second. Other views? Larry and then Dana.
I would support that if you had said the non-hosted or the not a prime resident. The implication of what you said was both categories.
Oh yeah, I did. So you're saying you would second it if it was one short-term rental per 2 week period for a non-hosted rental and no limits for the hosted rental? Is that?
But you could do it one at a time.
Yeah.
You could do it just for that category would be my recommendation. And to Art's point, we're talking about legal primary residency versus non-legal primary residency. So just to be clear. So yeah, I would split that into 2 parts. Then you can come back on the second part that said if you are a legal resident, then you address the limits on that separately.
All right, so the motion would be one short-term rental per 2 week period year-round for non-hosted rentals. We'll talk about the definition of hosted in the next one. So that's a motion. Is there a second?
I would second that.
Larry Dunn is a second. Debate on the motion. Okay, that's one short-term rental per 2 week period for non-hosted rentals. Beth?
Was that all year round or
That's how I defined it. Yeah, all year round. I'm open to suggestion.
okay. Thank you. That answers my question.
Okay. Other discussion on the motion? Lynn?
Yes, I think that's, again, by not differentiating more the type of owner, I think that is a lot of activity. And if you have many people, again, it's to Dana's point, it's how many people are doing it and how many people are not. It's not their primary residence. I think that could have deleterious effects on the community.
Okay, others? Larry?
I'm confused with Lynn's comment because that's not very many days.
Well, it could be a lot of,
You don't know how many days it is.
Well, yeah, you do.
No.
yeah, here's where, Larry, here's where I think the answer to her concern is, it could be a lot of days if the rental was for 2 weeks. Every 2
Correct.
weeks. Then you'd have 365 days a year. But the premise of this is people are doing short-term rentals, which by their nature are 3 or 4 days at a time. So it comes out to be around 75, 80, whatever, if you max out according to this proposed approach. Lynn is saying the 75 or 80 or whatever it is too many. And it's for us to decide whether we agree or not.
If there are a lot of people doing it, and if there are people that are hardly ever here in town, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, Dana, did you have your hand up on this? Dana? Okay, unmute and
Since it's Dana Oviatt. And this gets the crux of the problem. We're assuming a lot, and we each have our own set of assumptions. Rick is assuming that not much is going to happen with both the number of people who want to become short-term rentals in the future and with respect to the frequency with which a short-term operator is going to want to operate. And I may have a different set of assumptions, which is a lot more, liberal or conservative, however you want to phrase it. And I just want to, that's part of the problem. And that's why I wouldn't vote for this. I couldn't vote for this particular motion.
okay. You've hit the nail on the head in regulatory process. It's very difficult to predict how people will respond to a changed circumstance. So we are, to some extent, trying to figure out what we, the elected commissioners, think they're liable to do. But you can't, until you go through the aftermath, you won't know the answer to that. Dana? No?
Dana Oviatt again. I was just going to comment that I think if you were going to err on the side of erring on anything, you should err on the side that short-term rental activity will increase, both in terms of, well, certainly in terms of the numbers, because, and that's the reason why we're trying to regulate, because we assume that it's going to increase. A year ago, I did a study of Noank, and I showed that short-term rental activity had increased. I think it was 75, 100%. I don't know what it's done in the last couple of years, but that's the kind of growth that you should assume if you're going to look at short-term rental regulation.
Well, I would not assume that at all. That was growth with no regulation of the activity. You're talking about having an ordinance that, in theory, will have the 3-year moratorium and a 1 rental per 2-week period and a permit that could be revoked for cause. Those are all things that didn't occur, that weren't existing in the last 3 years when you saw the growth that you said. So to presume that past growth is going to happen in the future under the new regulatory environment, I don't agree with that. Otherwise, I would suggest that those limits be stronger. Nip.
Yeah, I strongly agree with Dana's position that we need to err on the side of assuming maybe not the worst case, but a worst case than what we're faced with. And we should protect ourselves, protect not ourselves, but protect the community against it, particularly protect the village against it.
Okay. All right. Others? Lynn?
I'm going to say something in defense of the short-term rental operator. And, you know, I'm not supposed to get down in the weeds, but I think when we're making these decisions now, we have to realize the effect on them. You know, so you're saying there can be one party in a 2-week period. So now we have this calendar set up. And I, as a short-term rental operator, I've got a calendar and it's wide open. And someone comes and says, okay, I want this time, and it spills one day over into the next time period. And then I've got to decide whether or not I'm going to take them or not, or reject that whole one because this is going to limit me to during the next time period to one. I mean, I think that's, you know, it's putting them into kind of like a crapshoot thing with this nitpicky kind of detail. I think it's just really difficult for them, and it's not anything that really affects how well they're running their business.
Others? Okay, other comments on the motion? I'll read it again for the record. One short-term rental per 2-week period year-round for non-hosted rentals. My motion, Larry second. Okay, all those in favor, raise your hand. See 3, all those opposed. See 2. All right, motion carries. All right. That was to Dana's, well, there's a corollary or follow-on motion. Larry, you had wanted that broken out that way for non-hosted rentals. So the next motion in your mind was what kind of limits for hosted rentals? And I think I heard you say don't bother or no limits. And that's one of the ways I was leaning as I vacillated back and forth on top of the fence. Is that still your view, that the next motion would be no limits for hosted rentals? You're muted.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So motion would be short-term rental operator, hosted short-term rental operations will have no daily limits or no limits per time period. That clear as mud? Hosted short-term rentals will have no number of days per month limits. All right, that's motion. Is there a second? Second by Larry Dunn. Okay, discussion on the motion. Lynn?
Yeah, so now you've got to get into what do you mean by hosted?
Yeah, yeah. I'm amenable to, well, a broad range of definitions. My view when I offered this motion, the other one as well as this one, hosted to me now, let me back up. A month ago in my proposal, I had a very broad definition. It included the agent, could be next door. I didn't mention it earlier tonight, but I cut all of that away and said it's too complicated and people didn't respond well to it. I would say the owner is present. If you want to say the legal resident is present, that's open to debate, and I'm not going to argue one way strongly or the other. When I say owner is present, to me, that's the person who's going to control potentially excessive behavior. It doesn't address, this motion doesn't address the whole frequency of turnover things, but I would maintain that if a person is, the owner is in the house and renting part of it to short-term renters, it's very likely we won't have the kind of bad behavior that upsets the tranquility of the neighborhood. And therefore, whether they turn over frequently or not is not such a big deal as it might be in other circumstances. You've got the owner there, but that may not be a feeling that everybody shares. So put it out there so you can think about it. Nip.
I think, I think we're missing the point of, you talk about objectionable behavior. Presumably you mean noise, parking, not handling the garbage correctly. The point that some of us have been trying to focus on is the quality of life in the neighborhood. If there's a lot of turnover, whether it's once every 2 weeks, it's every 3 nights, even if the owner is on site, the amount of turnover, whether it looks like an inn as opposed to a house, is very different from the neighbors. And the fact that there could be constant turnover in one of these hosted properties, it's really like you've chosen to live next door to a B&B or a small inn. That is very different in its impact on the neighborhood. Parking, noise, garbage aside. We said early on, we didn't want properties that look like hotels. I don't know what the difference is. If the owner is on site and they've got new people coming and going every few days, that's not a house. That's a bed and breakfast without the breakfast. It's an inn, it's a motel. The very thing we said we didn't want.
Good point in 2 regards, since it kind of was in response to me. Yeah, leave the unacceptable behavior aside for the moment. I agree with that. Does it influence you? I guess it doesn't, because my notes lean away. Does it influence you that with the owner there, the turnover is not so disruptive, not likely to be so disruptive? Or, and I think this is how you're going to come down, regardless of whether the owner is there, the constant every 3-4 days turnover is unacceptable to neighborhood tranquility. Second.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That's kind of, after I reflected on it as I was asking, that's where I thought you were coming from. It's still too much churn, to use that funny word again. All right. Well, that I'm somewhat persuaded by that. But when I offered that motion earlier, I couldn't get a second. So yeah, we might want to just leave it that way for now, understanding that we've made some real progress here tonight, more so than we've done in a lot of other meetings. And I know it's frustrating for me to say this to some people, but it doesn't mean that we aren't going to revise and reposition and come to slightly different adjustments as we move down the road to try and get something that, as Nip said, gets 3 comfortable votes. Before we get to the end of the night, though, I want to say something, because this is the first time we've had about a dozen spectators, which is healthy. I'm glad people are on. I want you all to understand that we're nowhere near having a draft ordinance to go to public hearing. We've got several more meetings. So when we take a vote that says once one rental per 2-week period, or how we dealt with who gets to do it, that's not a draft ordinance yet. It's not even close. There's a lot more other things that need to be discussed. So, I just want you to understand it's a long process. It's exhausting for us and it's troubling for you. And, eventually we'll get there, but it's not like these two things tonight are going to go to a public hearing next month. We're way far away from that. So having said that, it's about 5 minutes before 9. Those were the two issues that Dana said we should do first. We sorted.
Point of order.
Yeah, Larry.
There's a motion on the floor that was seconded.
Oh, gosh darn it. You're right. Thank you. The other one, hosted short-term rentals will have no number of days per month limits. Okay, more discussion. Any more discussion on that motion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor, raise your hand. Okay, those opposed? 2-2. Motion fails motion fails on a tie. Okay, so there is no proposed action on the hosted short-term rentals as we stand now. Is there any other discussion on that question? A different viewpoint on the hosted rentals? Anybody, Lynn?
I would just point out one thing was that in all this discussion, we're talking only about residential districts. And there's some of these in commercial districts, houses that were pre-existing prior to the 1955 regulations. So they are houses in the commercial districts. And so we can't leave those out. And so when you're thinking about things like host has to be on site, well, what if they're on site during the day instead of during the night? Because that's where their businesses are. So it's just something to keep in mind, not to neglect them.
Are they neglected the way we're discussing these things so far?
I think so.
Well, we're talking about the fire district. So, I mean, I don't.
But we're going on. But you're going on about, when you talk about hosted versus non-hosted, you're talking about living there. Well, the host generally may not be there all day long, may be there at night when they're there. Or what if the business owner is there during the day and not at night, but lives within the fire district and can be there quickly? So it's just something to keep in mind.
Well, that's more a question of how we define hosted. No one expects the owner to chain himself to the bedpost and be there 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the expectation is that they're there enough that they can control the situation if it needs to be controlled, which is a good point. I keep maintaining the list you all have asked for, or some of you have asked for, about unresolved issues that we need to get back to, and I'll have to put that one on. So it's temporary absences of the owner. Okay. Okay, does anybody have anything else to offer on this whole hosted issue? Okay, seeing Nip.
I'm just confused relative to the first motion that was approved. As I recall, it had an assumption that limits would be established for hosted versus non-hosted. They wouldn't be the same. We've got the limits for non-hosted. We don't have limits for hosted. Is that the first question to address at the next meeting?
If not the first question, it should be on the agenda for next meeting. I mean, that part is unresolved because the motion failed, and that's fine. But it leaves open the question of, okay, what should we do with them? Maybe it will require a motion to put the hosted rentals back in with the non-hosted. That may be one way of a solution. Or you may come up with some other ideas in the next 2 weeks of how to deal with that subset of short-term rental operators. It doesn't seem like we're going to get a solution to that one tonight, but it's food for thought for the next agenda.
Yeah, Nick Tanner, it seems logical that we would try and address that one and get an answer and not leave it unresolved.
Yep. Okay. So that can be next agenda. All right. Okay, I did want to make that point to the audience. My apologies for jumping out in front of an actual vote on a motion. I'm consistent in that regard. But I hope everybody will take it to heart. Now, any of the other business for the good of the order, or I will accept a motion to adjourn. Whose hand? Dana?
Yeah, I just have a question for my own clarification. So the motions that were passed tonight, those are binding, or we're going to return to them at some future date?
We're not going to return to them unless somebody moves to change them.
Okay, okay. And then my second question is, Larry and you had a discussion about who is eligible to vote, and I didn't follow that, but if you could follow up on that for me, for my clarification, I'd appreciate it.
The people who are eligible to vote are either elected commissioners or alternates who are seated for an absent elected commissioner.
Okay.
When an alternate is seated for an absent commissioner, he has full rights and privileges to vote, to participate as if he was an elected commissioner. Okay. All right. Anything else? Good of the order. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Nip.
Second.
And Larry. Okay. All those in favor, raise your hand. Okay. Thank you all. Good meeting. Appreciate it.
Let me stop the recording.
Yes,
Hold
stop
on.
recording, please. Thank you.
Stop recording.